Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to support this channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. Today I'm returning to the Deconverters Bible Study, and we're returning to the series called Tongues of Fire, where I study the book of Acts, and I look at the book of Acts from my standpoint as my old Pentecostal life as a Pentecostal preacher, how I look at it now as an atheist, and add some deconversion notes at the end. Today we're looking at Acts 8, 1 through 8, and talking about why Pentecostals think most churches are dead. Let's start by reading the text. And Saul approved of their killing. I want to pause the rereading here a little bit. This is referring back to the stoning of Stephen. And so some scholars debate whether this verse belongs in chapter 7 or chapter 8. But that's neither here nor there because the verses and chapters were added later anyway. But continuing on in the text. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged out both men and women and put them in prison. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Philip went down to a city of Samaria and proclaimed the Messiah there. When the crowds heard Philip and saw the signs that he performed, they paid close attention to what he said. For with shrieks impure spirits came out of many, and many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was great joy in the city. If I was preaching this text as a Pentecostal preacher, I would start by the reminder of the character of Saul in the story as a person that they laid the coats of at the feet in the stoning of Stephen. But the events that follow I would say as a Pentecostal preacher are some of the hallmarks of what the early church was and how it operated, and something that we should strive for to be good Pentecostals and be good believers in Jesus Christ in general. Those hallmarks being, number one, opposition by the religious leaders, two, persecution that leads to missionary zeal, and three, supernatural power. Firstly, there is the fact that the religious were the ones that persecuted the church. These were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the people that had problems with Jesus, now also had a problem with the church and began to persecute that church, most notably Saul of Tarsus. That the real church is one that has spiritual life as opposed to a religious dogma, and thus are those people that are spiritually dead churches. Those dead churches are just accepted by everybody because they don't have any real spiritual truth or life to them. I would push the Pentecostal narrative of persecution, not just by the world, but by the religious and churches who no longer have spiritual life but are dead. Secondly, I would say Pentecostals believe in missionary efforts very strongly, and they believe that wherever they have missionary efforts, there would be persecution that would follow their zeal and the truth of their message. In this case, the church begins to spread out because of that persecution, but the religiously dead also follow them. And as they preach the gospel of message, there becomes a conflict between the religious believers in a God and those that believe in a God of power that leads to contrast that people can see that brings people into the spiritual reality of God. In other words, Pentecostals have this notion that because of their spiritual power, you can see the truth and authenticity of how they do things compared to the dead churches around them. There very much is this idea that Pentecostals, that they are the true church because they minister in spiritual power. These signs will follow those believe is a very big hallmark of Pentecostal churches, which I'll get to in my deconversion notes in a moment. But that spiritual reality has to be there for a church not to be dead. Finally, this passage indicates that the early church was the true church because it possessed that real spiritual power. Philip becomes a great example of a true servant of God. He goes into the city and preaches with power. People listen to him and accept the message. And he casts out demons, which come out with shrieks, and he heals people. That is the hallmark of true evangelism. True evangelism to a Pentecostal isn't just about presenting the gospel in an accurate manner. It's also about all the miracles that are supposed to accompany that preaching of the gospel. And if you don't have those miracles, you're really not preaching the gospel to a lot of Pentecostals. Not all of them, but to a lot. At the end of such sermon, I would probably ask people to remember that there are those out there, as 2 Timothy 3:5 says, have a form of godliness but deny its power. And that verse also tells you not to associate with the religiously dead. And I would point out that as an extra point. as spiritual believers rather than religious devotees. A Pentecostal strives to be a spiritual believer, not a religious one, and that will automatically lead to persecution by the other religious people that you're trying to contrast yourself with. And, as you do that, trying to make sure that you're a living, breathing spiritual believer instead of a religious one, you're going to eventually come into conflict with not just the world, but the rest of the religious world known as Christianity as well. A hallmark of living churches is miracles of power and changed lives. Now, the end of the result is that most Pentecostals not only feel that the living church is one that will not only be persecuted by the world, but will be persecuted by the dead church as well. That they are the true remnant of the early church, and striving to be very much like the early church is pretty clear in most Pentecostal churches. It's very much part of their self-concept. And most churches are dead because of the lack of spiritual power is also clear in that attitude as well. Now, as an atheist who has lived in the Pentecostal church for 30 years before I became a Congregationalist, this narrative began to fall apart for me for a lot of reasons. Number one, as I always point out, Acts is purely for the Bible tells you so. There's no corroboration of the book of Acts' stories, including this one, in all of it. And the more I began to realize that Acts was really very much a take-it-by-faith book, or not at all, that became a problem. Secondly, I also noted at the time that Pentecostals were becoming more accepted, mainstream type churches when I was a minister. And so the idea that the outward religious church was persecuting Pentecostals as much just kind of began to fall apart for me. And it began to disappear. And so I began to realize that if we weren't being persecuted under this narrative by even the regular church, then were we really truly people of the early church and early faith anymore? And, thirdly, I began to see the fraud of the Pentecostal movement. The so-called miracles were nothing more than psychological manipulation most of the time. You could also chalk it up to mentalist tricks and the magicians, like the Penn and Teller parlor tricks. Any mentalist or magician that pulls rabbits out of a hat could explain most Pentecostal churches. I found that Pentecostal come off as presumptuous to many other of the faith. It's a religious arrogance even among Christians to think that everybody else is dead but you're alive. It's a Christian elitism on a whole nother level when you become a Pentecostal, because not only are you saying that you have accepted the gospel, but you have accepted the full gospel. I remember when I was in the Assemblies of God, they have a little symbol that represents the Assemblies of God, and the slogan is all the gospel. In other words, the Assemblies of God always kind of maintained as a Pentecostal denomination that they had the full gospel, not just the message of salvation, but also the message of being empowered by the Holy Spirit with evidence in speaking in tongues and signs and wonders following those that believe. That's the full gospel, which most churches run away from. Speaking off script and heading more into deconversion issues for me as I continue to deconstruct some of my Pentecostal life. One of the biggest things for me personally was seeing behind the curtain. When I became a Pentecostal minister, I began to note how much all of this was tricks or psychological manipulation. One pastor told me, when you're preaching, you got to get those people to got to prime the pump before the Holy Spirit really works. I had other people, you got to put a lot more emotion into your sermons so that people think you're spirit-filled. I began to also see the mentalist tricks where you can psychologically manipulate people, cold reading, all that stuff that's been debunked throughout the years as tricks and parlor tricks and stuff like that, though some people still believe in some of that stuff, is, you begin to see it. Some of the other things, like I remember when certain people in my church were getting, blood in their palms and stuff like that. And, you could see them, putting the red dye, whatever, with the liquid in their palms. We didn't have any cameras back then watching services, so you could get away with a lot more back then. Now with, cameras, these Pentecostal preachers on TV can pan away, do the trick, come back and say, oh, it's a miracle. If you look at Benny Hinn's miracles, they're just expectation, and then he does certain things, and bam, everything happens. And it's amazing how the cameraman never seems to fall under the power when it comes to Benny Hinn. But you begin to see the parlor tricks, you begin to see the manipulation, you begin to see it, and all that begins to fall apart. So the whole idea of having greater spiritual power begins to diminish in your brain, and I began to lose it. Once I began to realize that a lot of the things I saw in the church, the Pentecostal church, were nothing more than those things: psychological manipulation, mentalist tricks, sleight of hand illusion kind of things. Once that became apparent to me, I couldn't see behind, I couldn't go back to not seeing behind that curtain. That's where, to me, the Wizard of Oz loses his smoke and fire, and he's just a face on a wall that talks. Okay, that part goes away later for me, but at that point, the spiritual powers, the search for a real miracle, became a real big deal for me for most of my Pentecostal life. And when I concluded that maybe real miracles don't happen anymore, that was a big blow to my Pentecostalism. The other thing that kind of went away from me is this spiritual elitist type thinking, of thinking that you can be a better believer than anybody else. When I became a Congregationalist, this was probably one of the biggest things that left for me at that point. Was like, there's a whole bunch of believers out here that are good people that are really looking for God and doing all the things. And it's not just Pentecost. Pentecostals have this way of self-isolating themselves, not just from people outside the Christian faith, but also from within the Christian faith itself into their own little group. It really creates a very cult-like atmosphere that you have to really get out of. When people ask me what my real struggle with deconversion, what was the cultic thing that came out of it, it was more my Pentecostals days than my Congregationalist days. But the Pentecostals have this cult-like mentality of, we got to be away from the people that have a form of godliness but deny its power. We need to stop associating with these people so that we can really press into the faith and really be people of faith. And then, this of course leads to you feeling like you are a real special person, because not only God has chosen you for salvation through the gospel, but also he's empowered you to serve him. This is a real ego trip that you have to get over, and it really diminished for me the longer I was in the ministry. The more I preached, the more I was a pastor doing the things, the more I began to realize I wasn't all that special. When I went into the ministry, it was about building a true church, and I wasn't really after a mega church. I just wanted a church that had a lot of spiritual power and Pentecostal power. And once I finally realized that wasn't going to happen, it was pretty easy to walk away from the Assemblies of God once I realized how much of a fraud it was, how much of a money-grubbing scheme it was, and how much of the stuff is just tricks and psychological manipulation. That became very easy for me to do, but it also meant that the special nature of who I was as a Pentecostal believer disappeared as well. So that's kind of my thoughts on this passage and how it, how Pentecostals look at people as dead. They really do look at other churches as the dead church, and they're the living church. Okay, that there's, if you go to the end of the book of Revelation, they would say that most churches are dead churches now. And then you also have the aspect of, in this lukewarm church, we're the ones seeking to be hot. This is the last age of the church. We're always in Laodicea and with end times, right? And I'm one of the people that's trying to be hot for God instead of being cold. And that becomes the mentality. And so once I got past that, it's a downhill climb from there. It's very easy to get over this stuff once you see what it really is. And for those of you who are former Pentecostal believers deconverting, understand that this is perfectly natural. You're going through a process where you're realizing that this stuff really isn't real, and people can, just change the narrative and do whatever they want and psychologically manipulate people in the church. It becomes a real, and the problem is some of it is some people are really sincere. They really think that that's spiritual power, but it's not. And so, whatever you're going through, remember that a lot of people get caught up in this. I would say Pentecostalism is one of the most cultic versions. I don't know if it's as bad as some of the other ones, but it can be, depending on the individual church. So be very careful in dealing with Pentecostals. They really do think that they are an elitist remnant group, when you look at their doctrine and theology, even if they were to deny it. "Oh, I'm no real humble and I'm just a believer, I just happen to be Pentecostal." Well, look at your doctrine. Your doctrine puts you at an elitism far beyond most other churches, so you might want to look at that. But that's it for me. I'd be interested in hearing your comments, especially those of you deconverting from Pentecostal faith. I always enjoy listening to your comments because it reminds me of who I was and what I am now. So thanks for all of that. Make sure you comment. Before you leave, like the video. I appreciate that. It always helps get me noticed by the YouTube algorithm. And also, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Join the Rabyd Nation. But if you want to become a citizen of the Rabyd Nation, the best way to support this channel is to become a member. And that allows me the monthly support that continues to allow me to make these videos, to continue to normalize atheism, deconversion. In these particular cases, Tongues of Fire is very much about helping you who are deconverting from a Pentecostal charismatic type faith. I'm trying to help you out as one who used to be there myself and used to be a Pentecostal preacher. There's also a PayPal link if you want to give to Warren directly, as well as super chat, super thanks are always welcome. Thank you all everybody for giving me support over the years. I appreciate it very much. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over. So you want to take all your time, money, and opportunities, give them to yourself, the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. You'll be happier if you do. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end and a waste of time. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.